there's a moment that most people missed, not because it wasn't visible, but because they didn't understand what they were actually looking at. When a husband says he's no longer interested in intimacy, most people assume distance, emotional disconnect, maybe resentment. But this wasn't distance. This was leverage. Because intimacy in this family wasn't just affection. It was currency. It was approved. It was status. It was stable. And once that currency was withdrawn, everything else began to collapse exactly the way it was designed to. This wasn't accidental emotional neglect. It was structural control. And once you understand that, everything that follows stops looking like chaos and starts looking like consequence. The most dangerous form of control isn't yelling. It isn't a threat. It isn't explosive anger. It's withdrawal. Because withdrawal creates confusion. It creates self-doubt. It creates a psychological vacuum where the person being deprived starts to blame themselves for the absence. And that's exactly what happened here. He didn't need to scream. He didn't need to punish loudly. He only needed to remove the horror. One thing he knew she valued most: connection. And once that connection disappeared, she didn't just lose affection. She lost footing. Because when someone conditions you to associate their approval with your emotional safety, losing that approval doesn't feel like rejection. It feels like danger. And this is where people misunderstand Christine's breaking point. They think it was about romance. They think it was about physical intimacy. It wasn't. It was about authority being exercised in its purest form. He knew what she needed, and he made the conscious decision not to give it. Not because he couldn't, because he wouldn't. That distinction changes everything. Because inability creates sympathy. Refusal creates power. And power was always the real center of gravity in this family. You can see it in the timing. The shift didn't happen when the relationship first struggled. It happened when independence started becoming visible. When Christine began emotionally separating from the structure that had defined her entire adult life. That's when intimacy disappeared. Not before, after. Which means it wasn't the cause of disconnection. It was the response to disconnection. And that reveals intent. Because removing intimacy at that exact moment sends a message without saying a word. It tells the other person, your emotional security is conditional. It tells them stability is not guaranteed. It tells them you don't control the terms of your own relationship. He controlled the emotional thermostat. He decided when warmth existed and when it didn't. He decided when affection was available and when it was withheld. And once someone has that level of control, they don't need compliance. They expect it. But something shifted that he didn't anticipate. Christine stopped negotiating for warmth. She stopped trying to earn access to emotional stability. She stopped chasing approval. And that is the moment control begins to break. Because control only works when the other person is still seeking permission. The second they stop asking, the entire structure destabilizes. This is why the emotional withdrawal became more visible, more explicit, more unapologetic toward the end. It wasn't subtle anymore. It was declarative. He wasn't trying to preserve the relationship. He was redefining it on his terms. And what made it more devastating wasn't the withdrawal itself. It was the justification. Because instead of acknowledging the withdrawal as a choice, he reframed it as a reaction. Suddenly, her behavior was the problem. Her attitude was the problem. Her independence was the problem. This is the psychological inversion that keeps people trapped. The person causing the deprivation becomes the person claiming injury, and the person experiencing the deprivation becomes the person defending themselves. It reverses the emotional burden. And once that reversal happens, the person being deprived stops asking why they're being hurt. They start asking what they did to deserve it. That's the trap. And Christine lived inside that trap for years. Not because she was weak, because she was conditioned. Conditioned to believe that stability required compliance. Conditioned to believe that harmony required self-sacrifice. Conditioned to believe that questioning authority created danger. And when someone lives inside that system long enough, the loss of approval doesn't just feel painful, it feels existential. Because approval wasn't just emotional, it was structural. It determined the position. It determined security. It determines belonging. And once belonging becomes conditional, the person controlling that condition holds absolute authority. But authority has a weakness. It depends on belief. The moment the person being controlled stops believing in the authority, its power begins to evaporate. And that's exactly what started happening. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, dangerously. Because the most threatening person to a control structure isn't the one who argues loudly. It's the one who emotionally detaches silently. Christine didn't explode. She disengaged. And disengagement is irreversible. Because once someone sees the structure clearly, they can't unsee it. They can't return to believing that the approval they're chasing is freely given. They understand it was always conditional, always calculated, always controlled. And once that realization sets in, compliance stops being instinctive. It starts feeling like surrender. This is why her exit didn't look chaotic. It looked calm. Calm is the most dangerous signal in a collapsing control structure, because calm means the emotional dependency is already gone. By the time she physically left, she had already emotionally separated long before. And that's the part that destabilized everything else, because the structure depended on her participation. It depended on her belief. It depended on her emotional investment. And when that investment disappeared, the authority lost its foundation. But while Christine was quietly dismantling the emotional control that had defined her life, something else was happening in parallel. Something that didn't look emotional at all. It looked legal, technical, procedural. But underneath it, the same pattern was emerging. Because control doesn't just operate emotionally, it operates structurally. And the moment Christine stepped outside the structure, the vulnerabilities attached to her family name became exposed in ways no one anticipated. That's when Isabel became a target, not because of who she was personally, but because of what she represented. She represented access, visibility, perceived vulnerability, and most importantly, perceived resources. Because when someone carries a last name associated with public exposure, they stop being seen as an individual. They become seen as an opportunity. And the timing of the lawsuit wasn't random. It arrived after the emotional structure of the family had already begun collapsing publicly, which meant the perception of stability had weakened. And predators don't move when structures look strong. They move when structures look unstable. That's when lawsuits appear. That's when claims surface. That's when pressure gets applied. Not necessarily because the claims are strong, but because the target looks exposed. And exposure invites challenges. But what happened next didn't follow the expected pattern. Because the moment institutional protection entered the situation, the dynamic changed instantly. The pressure didn't increase. It reversed. And that reversal revealed something critical about the original claim. Because legitimate claims strengthen under scrutiny. Weak claims collapse under scrutiny. And this one collapsed faster than anyone expected. Not slowly. Not gradually. Completely. Which raises a question most people never stop to ask. Was the lawsuit the real threat? Or was it simply another attempt to apply pressure to a family whose internal structure had already begun breaking apart? Because pressure doesn't always come from inside. Sometimes it arrives from outside, precisely when internal defenses are weakest. And the timing of this lawsuit suggests something far more strategic than coincidence. But the legal collapse was only the beginning. Because the real shift wasn't happening in courtrooms. It was happening in identity. And nowhere was that shift more visible than in Janelle. Not in what she said, but in what she stopped asking permission for. Because for the first time in decades, she made a decision without negotiating approval. She chose something independently, and that sounds small. Until you understand what it means inside a lifetime of conditioned compliance. Because independence isn't just about action. It's about psychological separation. It's about no longer needing validation to justify your existence. And once that separation happens, the control structure doesn't just weaken, it becomes irrelevant. But irrelevance is something control structures cannot survive, because control only exists when it's needed, and the moment it's no longer needed, it disappears, which is exactly what started happening, not dramatically, quietly, irreversibly. And the most unsettling part isn't that it happened. It's how long it took for it to begin, because once you see the pattern clearly, you realize something that changes the entire story. This wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a delayed awakening, and delayed awakenings are the most dangerous kind. Because they don't just change the future, they redefine the past. What makes this situation disturbing isn't the conflict. Conflict is normal. What makes it disturbing is how predictable the outcome became once the emotional hierarchy was exposed. Because once a man stops pretending to distribute love equally, the illusion collapses instantly. And that's exactly what happened inside Sister Wives. The emotional economy of this family didn't crash suddenly. It failed slowly, quietly, and most importantly, selectively. You could see it in the way Cody Brown began conserving his emotional energy, not for the family, but for one specific relationship. And when emotional energy becomes scarce, people reveal their true priorities, not their spoken priorities, their real ones. Because attention is the purest form of loyalty, and he stopped giving it to most of them. At first, the changes were subtle enough to deny. That's what makes emotional abandonment so effective. It hides inside plausible explanations. Stress, logistics, miscommunication, timing, but those explanations only work temporarily, because patterns always expose intention. You began seeing him show patience in one house, and irritation in another. You began seeing him listen carefully in one conversation, and dismiss quickly in another. You began seeing him fight for one relationship, and tolerate the collapse of others. That's not confusion, that's selection. And the person who benefited most from that selection was Robin Brown. Not necessarily because she demanded it directly, but because she became the safest emotional investment. and safety is addictive, especially for someone like Cody, whose identity depends on admiration. Robin offered him something the others stopped offering: emotional predictability. She didn't challenge his authority in the same way. She didn't expose his contradictions as aggressively. She didn't force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. She made him feel stable. And stability feels like love when everything else feels like resistance. But here's where the psychological shift becomes dangerous. Because once a man starts associating one woman with peace and the others with tension, he doesn't just prefer one relationship. He begins resenting the others for existing, not consciously at first, but emotionally, because their needs begin to feel like burdens. Their feelings begin to feel like accusations. Their presence begins to feel like pressure, and pressure threatens the illusion of control. You could see this most clearly in how he responded to emotional pain from the other wives. When Christine Brown expressed loneliness, his response wasn't urgency. It was defensiveness. That's a critical distinction. Because urgency signals care, defensiveness signals ego protection. He wasn't trying to understand why she felt abandoned. He was trying to protect himself from feeling blamed, which tells you something uncomfortable. He wasn't emotionally invested in solving her pain. He was invested in avoiding responsibility for causing it. And once that dynamic begins, repair becomes almost impossible. Because repair requires humility, and humility requires admitting emotional failure. But Cody's identity wasn't built on humility. It was built on authority. Authority doesn't apologize easily. Authority explains, justifies, reframes. Authority shifts focus away from its own shortcomings. And over time, this created a devastating emotional imbalance. Because Christine wasn't just losing affection, she was losing emotional relevance. That's worse, because rejection hurts. But irrelevance erases you. It tells you that your pain doesn't even require a response. And once someone realizes their pain no longer influences your behavior, they stop believing in the relationship entirely. Not immediately, but inevitably. And what's fascinating is how clearly you could see the contrast when he interacted with Robin. His tone softened, his patience expanded, his emotional availability increased. Not because he suddenly became more capable of love, but because he was choosing where to invest it. That's the truth no one wants to say out loud. He didn't lose the ability to care. He redirected it. And that distinction changes everything. Because it means the emotional neglect experienced by the other wives wasn't accidental. It was selective. And selective neglect creates a uniquely painful psychological experience. Because it forces the neglected person to confront an unbearable possibility. They weren't abandoned because love was impossible. They were abandoned because love was available, just not for them. You could see how this realization began reshaping the emotional posture of Janelle Brown. Janelle had always operated with emotional independence. She didn't demand constant reassurance. She didn't center her identity around romantic validation, which made her easier to deprioritize, because she tolerated emotional distance longer than the others. But tolerance isn't acceptance. It's endurance. And endurance has a breaking point. What makes Janelle's situation psychologically fascinating is that she didn't explode emotionally. She detached. Detachment is far more dangerous than anger, because anger still seeks engagement. Detachment signals emotional exit. It means the person has stopped expecting change, and once expectation dies, the relationship dies with it. You could see it in her calmness, her clarity, her lack of desperation. She wasn't trying to fix the relationship anymore. She was evaluating whether it deserved to exist at all. And that shift terrified Cody more than confrontation ever could, because confrontation gives him something to argue against. Detachment gives him nothing. No leverage, no emotional access, no influence. And influence is the foundation of his identity. Without it, he becomes emotionally irrelevant, which is the exact position the other wives had been forced into. Now, the roles were reversing, and he didn't know how to handle it, because his authority only functioned when people emotionally depended on him. Once they stopped depending on him, his authority became symbolic, meaningless. And that's when his frustration began escalating into something more revealing. Not sadness, not regret, but anger. Anger is often misunderstood. People think anger comes from pain. But in situations like this, anger comes from loss of control. He wasn't angry because he was losing love. He was angry because he was losing influence. There's a difference. Love can exist without control, but control cannot exist without emotional dependency. And dependency was disappearing, one by one, silently, irreversibly. Even Mary Brown, who had endured emotional isolation longer than anyone, eventually reached a psychological threshold. Mary's situation was perhaps the most emotionally complex, because she stayed physically present long after emotional reciprocity had vanished, which creates a unique psychological prison. You're not fully rejected, but you're not fully loved. You exist in emotional limbo, And limbo slowly erodes self-worth because human beings measure their value through emotional responsiveness, not words, behavior. And his behavior toward Mary had become painfully neutral. Neutrality may look peaceful on the surface, but emotionally it's devastating because neutrality signals indifference, and indifference is the opposite of love. Not hate, indifference. Hate still requires emotional investment. Indifference requires nothing, and nothing is what she was receiving. This created a silent emotional hierarchy that everyone could feel but no one could fully dismantle. Robin at the center, the others orbiting farther and farther away. Not because they chose distance initially, but because distance was imposed gradually. And what makes this even more psychologically unsettling is that the system itself depended on denial, because acknowledging the hierarchy would destroy the foundational myth of equality, and equality was the justification for everything. Without equality, the structure wasn't plural marriage. It was emotional monogamy disguised as plural marriage. And once that truth becomes visible, the entire moral framework collapses. Because now the sacrifices made by the other wives can no longer be justified. They weren't sacrifices for family unity. They were sacrifices for someone else's emotional preference. That realization is devastating, because it forces you to confront the possibility that your loyalty wasn't building something shared. It was sustaining something exclusive. And exclusivity was never the promise. Equality was. That's why the emotional exits, when they finally happened, felt less like impulsive decisions and more like delayed acts of self-preservation. Because the emotional damage had already been done long before the physical separations occurred. The separation was just the visible confirmation of an invisible truth. The family had already fractured emotionally. The only thing left was for reality to catch up. And perhaps the most uncomfortable question isn't whether Cody loved Robin more. It's whether he ever intended to maintain emotional equality once he realized he didn't have to. Because power changes behavior, not always loudly, but permanently. And once he realized the system would tolerate imbalance, he stopped correcting it. He started living inside it, fully and unapologetically, which raises an even darker possibility. What if the collapse of the family wasn't a failure? What if it was the inevitable outcome of a truth that had been quietly growing for years? A truth no one was willing to confront until it was too late. What makes this phase of the collapse uniquely disturbing isn't the emotional withdrawal itself. It's the moment the withdrawal stopped being hidden. Because secrecy protects perception, but visibility destroys it. And once the emotional favoritism became visible, not just privately felt, but publicly undeniable, the entire psychological contract holding the family together began dissolving in real time. Not dramatically, not explosively, but with quiet, irreversible clarity. The shift wasn't in what Cody felt. It was in what he stopped pretending not to feel. That distinction matters, because performance had always been part of the structure. The idea of plural marriage as it existed in their family depended on performance. It depended on equal gestures, equal effort, equal emotional signaling, not necessarily equal love, but equal presentation of love. And once he stopped performing equality, the illusion lost its structural support. You could see it in the way he stopped compensating. He no longer attempted to rebalance emotional deficits. He no longer made symbolic gestures to maintain equilibrium. He allowed the imbalance to exist openly. And when imbalance is allowed to exist openly, it stops being an accident. It becomes policy. This is the moment where psychological harm accelerates, not because conditions worsen, but because denial becomes impossible. Christine understood this before anyone else, not intellectually, emotionally, because emotional neglect isn't confusing when it becomes consistent. Consistency removes ambiguity. It tells you the truth without requiring explanation. She wasn't reacting to one moment. She was reacting to a pattern that had stopped disguising itself. And once she recognized that pattern, something inside her shifted permanently. She stopped trying to earn emotional restoration. That's critical, because people only chase restoration when they believe it's possible. Once they stop believing, their behavior changes in subtle but irreversible ways. They stop negotiating. They stop persuading. They stop hoping. Hope is the final emotional investment. And Christine withdrew hers, not loudly, but completely, which created a psychological vacuum Cody didn't know how to fill, because his authority had always relied on emotional compliance. Compliance doesn't require happiness, it requires presence. And Christine's emotional presence had disappeared long before her physical departure. This is where his behavior became even more revealing. He didn't respond with vulnerability. He responded with accusation. He reframed her withdrawal as betrayal. Not because it was betrayal, but because framing it that way preserved his self-image. Self-image is fragile when built on perceived leadership, because leadership requires validation from followers. Once followers stop validating, leadership becomes self-declared, meaningless without emotional recognition, and Christine stopped recognizing it. That's why her exit destabilized him more than Mary's emotional absence ever did. Mary had been emotionally disconnected for years, but she remained structurally compliant. Her compliance allowed him to preserve the illusion of authority. Christine's departure shattered that illusion publicly. It introduced a dangerous precedent. It proved exit was possible, not just emotionally, but physically. And once one person exits successfully, others begin reevaluating their own confinement. Not immediately, but inevitably. Because exit transforms imagination. It converts abstract dissatisfaction into concrete possibility. Janelle watched this transformation carefully, not impulsively, strategically. Janelle's psychology was different from Christine's. Christine needed emotional fulfillment. Janelle needed emotional stability, and stability had quietly eroded beyond repair. What's fascinating about Janelle is how long she maintained rational loyalty. She didn't stay because she was emotionally fulfilled. She stayed because she believed in structural purpose, family unity, shared goals, collective identity. But purpose cannot survive in an emotionally unequal system, because purpose requires mutual investment. Once investment becomes one-sided, purpose becomes exploitation, and exploitation is unsustainable once recognized. Recognition is the turning point, not the suffering itself, but the awareness of it. Janelle became aware that her emotional independence, once her strength, had become the justification for her neglect. She wasn't prioritized because she didn't demand prioritization, which exposed an uncomfortable truth. The system didn't reward strength. It rewarded emotional centrality. And emotional centrality belonged exclusively to Robin, not officially, but practically. This created an invisible monopoly on emotional influence. Robin didn't need to assert control aggressively. Her position had already been secured psychologically, because Cody had attached his emotional stability to her presence. Attachment creates bias, not intentionally, but inevitably. People protect the source of their emotional stability, even subconsciously. This protection manifests in subtle behavioral advantages: more patience, more empathy, more forgiveness, more effort, not because the person deserves more, but because losing them feels more threatening. And threat perception dictates emotional investment. Robin represented emotional safety. The others represented emotional complexity. Safety attracts. Complexity exhausts. This is the uncomfortable psychological truth behind his choices. He didn't consciously decide to love one more. He unconsciously decided to protect the one who made him feel most secure. And once that decision stabilized, reversing it would require emotional risk. Risk he had no incentive to take, because he wasn't experiencing emotional loss in the same way the others were. He still had emotional fulfillment, just not with them, which created a devastating asymmetry. They were experiencing abandonment. He was experiencing consolidation. That asymmetry made empathy difficult, because empathy requires shared emotional reality, and their emotional realities had diverged completely. This is why his reactions often appeared cold, not because he lacked emotion, but because his emotional needs were already being met elsewhere. Unmet needs create urgency. Met needs create indifference. And indifference is psychologically lethal to relationships, because relationships survive conflict. They do not survive indifference. Conflict signals emotional investment. Indifference signals emotional closure. And closure had already occurred, internally for him long before any public separation was announced. This is where Mary's situation becomes especially tragic, because Mary remained psychologically tethered to a relationship that had already been emotionally terminated. Not formally, but functionally. Functional termination is more painful than formal termination, because formal termination provides clarity. Functional termination provides confusion. You exist in a state of emotional uncertainty, waiting for restoration that never arrives, interpreting neutrality as temporary distance rather than permanent withdrawal. Hope delays acceptance. Acceptance enables exit, and Mary's hope prolonged her emotional captivity. But hope cannot survive indefinitely without reinforcement. Eventually, reality overwhelms optimism. And when that happens, emotional detachment becomes inevitable, not as a choice, but as a survival mechanism. Because the human psyche cannot tolerate infinite rejection without adaptation. Adaptation often appears as emotional numbness. Numbness protects self-worth by reducing emotional exposure. You stop expecting. You stop investing. You stop needing. Not because you don't care, but because caring has become psychologically unsafe. This transformation happened slowly across the entire family structure, not simultaneously, but sequentially. Each wife reaching her psychological threshold at different times. Each exit reinforcing the legitimacy of the next. This created a domino effect of emotional liberation, not driven by rebellion, but driven by recognition. Recognition that the emotional contract had already been broken. They weren't destroying the family. They were acknowledging its prior collapse. That distinction is essential, because it reframes the narrative entirely. The visible separations weren't acts of destruction. They were acts of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that emotional equality had ceased to exist. Acknowledgement that emotional reciprocity had been replaced with emotional hierarchy. Acknowledgement that the system was no longer functioning as promised. And perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of all is how Cody interpreted these exits. He didn't interpret them as consequences. He interpreted them as disloyalty, because from his perspective, the structure still existed, even if the emotional substance had disappeared. This reveals a profound psychological disconnect. He was preserving the form of the family long after its emotional function had died. Form without function is performance, and performance cannot sustain human connection indefinitely. Eventually, reality asserts itself, emotionally first, physically second, and once physical separation occurs, psychological reconciliation becomes exponentially more difficult, because distance provides clarity. Clarity dismantles denial. Denial is the final defense mechanism protecting unsustainable systems. Once denial collapses, truth becomes unavoidable. And the truth in this case was devastatingly simple. The family didn't fail all at once. It failed the moment emotional equality stopped being practiced and started being replaced with emotional preference. Everything that followed wasn't the cause. It was the confirmation. The most chilling part of this collapse isn't the obvious favoritism. It's the normalization of it. Once emotional preference became routine, it stopped being questioned. Human beings are remarkably adaptable, but only up to a point. Adaptation doesn't mean acceptance. It means survival. For Mary, Janelle, and Christine, the adaptation came in different forms: quiet endurance, strategic disengagement, or eventual departure. But the psychological impact shared a common thread: the internalization of inequity. Internalization is dangerous because it disguises itself as self-blame. When a system rewards one person disproportionately, others unconsciously start looking for ways they failed, rather than seeing the system's failure. Mary spent years oscillating between hope and despair. The hope that Cody might restore emotional balance. The despair when she realized he would not. Every small gesture of attention or acknowledgement became magnified. A smile, a compliment, a brief conversation. It wasn't just attention. It was a lifeline, a signal that the hierarchy could shift, even temporarily. Janelle approached it differently. She recognized the imbalance but didn't fight for restoration in the same way. Instead, she became the observer, the analyst within the family unit. She measured reactions, noted patterns, and quietly adjusted her expectations. Her loyalty wasn't rooted in emotional fulfillment, but in control of her own reactions and survival within the system. Christine's response was the most decisive. Unlike Mary, she reached the psychological limit where hope could no longer survive. Her emotional withdrawal was complete. And once withdrawal is complete, it's irreversible. It's not anger. It's not rebellion. It's an internal acknowledgement. The system doesn't serve me, so I will stop serving it. This withdrawal triggers a cascade in any hierarchical relationship. Cody, accustomed to compliance, faced resistance, not as confrontation, but as absence. Absence is psychologically destabilizing because humans are wired to respond to presence. We can tolerate conflict. We cannot tolerate voids. Robin's role complicates this dynamic even further. She didn't orchestrate the imbalance overtly, but her emotional centrality acted as the anchor for Cody's attention. And the more Cody relied on her for emotional stability, the less he invested in the others. The imbalance became self-reinforcing. Robin's influence grew and the others diminished, not due to malice, but due to psychological mechanics. Here's the subtle, almost invisible truth. Dominance in a relationship often operates through emotional leverage rather than authority. Cody's position wasn't just about being head of the family. It was about whose emotional presence he depended on the most. And dependence creates bias. Even subconscious bias becomes behavior. This is why empathy falters under imbalance. Empathy requires shared experience and risk. When one partner is emotionally fulfilled elsewhere, the capacity for understanding unmet needs diminishes. You begin to rationalize absence as justified. Not because you're cruel, but because your emotional system no longer perceives it as urgent. The wife's cumulative responses highlight another psychological phenomenon: emotional triangulation. When one person becomes the central emotional anchor, all others are forced into secondary roles. Secondary roles require constant negotiation, suppression of needs, and careful calculation of emotional gestures. Over time, this fosters resentment, not openly expressed, but quietly accumulating. Resentment, once internalized, alters perception. Small slights become magnified. Minor frustrations feel monumental. And yet, outwardly, the family maintains a facade of unity. This creates a profound cognitive dissonance. The visible reality says cohesion. The emotional reality says fragmentation. Fragmentation accelerates when people begin experimenting with exit. Christine's withdrawal was the first signal that the system could fail without catastrophic collapse. The psychological permission to disengage spreads subtly. Once one person establishes that emotional needs can be prioritized over system loyalty, others begin exploring the same path, consciously or unconsciously. This is where public perception becomes dangerous. The family's televised representation often obscures these subtle dynamics, making them appear as abrupt conflicts or personality clashes. But the truth is far more insidious. The collapse had been brewing for years, invisible except to those living it. Reality TV amplifies surface drama while concealing the invisible erosion of trust and emotional reciprocity. Cody's inability to respond appropriately is telling. It's not about intelligence, morality, or affection. It's about emotional rigidity. When your entire identity depends on a hierarchy that is quietly disintegrating, your reflex is preservation. Maintain, structure, protect self-image, and interpret departures as betrayal rather than natural consequence. And this is why the pattern repeats. Emotional imbalance leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal destabilizes authority. Authority misinterprets departure. Misinterpretation fuels further imbalance. It's a feedback loop, psychological and relentless. At the core, the story is not just about favoritism or individual failures. It's about the mechanics of human attachment, dependence, and the catastrophic consequences of an invisible emotional hierarchy. The drama isn't manufactured. It's emergent. It's inevitable once the foundational assumptions of equality and reciprocity are broken. Every glance, every microgesture, every allocation of attention becomes a signal in this system. And the ones who understand these signals first, Christine and Janelle, are the first to adapt. Adaptation here doesn't mean submission. It means survival, recognition, liberation. The rest are trapped by hope, nostalgia, or emotional inertia. And inertia is deceptively powerful. It convinces people that systems will restore themselves, that absence is temporary, that imbalance can be corrected with effort. Often, it cannot. This is the psychological lesson hidden beneath every scene. Emotional imbalance, once normalized, erodes trust slowly but irreversibly. It reshapes behavior, perception, and the capacity for empathy. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for permission. It simply changes the rules of engagement, and survival becomes a personal calculus rather than a collective endeavor. The most powerful takeaway? Systems of dependence only appear stable until emotional contracts are broken. Once broken, survival, instincts replace loyalty, awareness replaces ignorance, and the illusion of cohesion collapses quietly, but completely. The next layer of this psychological landscape is manipulation, not the obvious, overt kind, but the invisible, almost imperceptible forms. Manipulation doesn't require malice. It requires leverage. And in this family, the leverage was emotional attention. Cody's favoritism didn't just give Robin power, it inadvertently created conditions for subtle control over the others. Every small interaction with Cody became a signal. Compliance is rewarded, withdrawal is penalized. Notice how these dynamics feed themselves. The more Robin becomes central, the more Cody depends on her. The more Cody depends, the more the other wives adjust, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid confrontation. The imbalance becomes encoded in behavior. No one plots it. It simply emerges from repeated emotional responses. The danger of this emergent imbalance is its invisibility. Outsiders see arguments, dramatic confrontations, public statements, but they miss the underlying psychological pressure. Who receives attention, who is left in absence, who adapts quietly. Adaptation is survival, but survival often comes at the cost of self-expression. Over time, the cost compounds. Mary's case is a prime example. She oscillates between seeking attention and withdrawing when it's denied. This push-pull creates tension not just with Cody, but with the other wives. It introduces unpredictability into the emotional ecosystem, and unpredictability is destabilizing. Humans prefer patterns. When patterns break, stress hormones rise and decisions become reactive rather than rational. Janelle, by contrast, learns to anticipate these fluctuations. She studies the emotional patterns, not the narrative. This isn't strategic manipulation, it's analytical survival. She can predict which gestures will elicit attention, which withdrawals will be noticed, and how to maintain her own emotional equilibrium. Her detachment protects her, even as it isolates her from authentic connection. Christine's approach is the most radical. Withdrawal is her strategy. By stepping back completely, she forces the system to respond, or fail. Absence in this context is a weapon because it exposes the fragility of the hierarchy. The system is only as strong as the participation it relies on. Remove participation, and the illusion of control collapses. Now, let's talk about Cody's perception of all this. Cody interprets behavior through the lens of authority rather than empathy. Absence is interpreted as betrayal. Withdrawal is interpreted as defiance. Yet in reality, these responses are natural, adaptive strategies to emotional imbalance. Misinterpretation fuels the next cycle of conflict, creating a loop of misunderstanding that looks like drama, but is actually psychological inevitability. Robin's emotional centrality also has a more subtle effect. She normalizes the imbalance. Her own confidence and attachment with Cody signal to the others that emotional resources are finite and must be competed for. This competition introduces anxiety, secrecy, and tension, even when outward behavior is calm. The psychological stakes are constant, unspoken, and relentless. Then there's the matter of public perception. Fans, critics, and media interpret these dynamics as conflict, favoritism, or personal failings. But the truth lies in invisible psychological currents: emotional withdrawal, adaptive compliance, silent observation. These are the patterns that shape the family far more than any argument or confrontation. Reality TV magnifies the spectacle while masking these subtle but consequential dynamics. Consider the consequences. Once these patterns are established, they self-perpetuate. Cody's reliance on one emotional anchor encourages others to withdraw, which in turn reinforces his dependence. Absence fuels centrality, and centrality reinforces absence. The system becomes a psychological Ouroboros, feeding on itself endlessly. Mary's intermittent attempts to reclaim attention are doomed not because of lack of effort, but because the system's feedback loops are misaligned with her emotional needs. The hierarchy punishes unpredictability and rewards alignment with the central anchor. Attempts to reset or disrupt the balance are absorbed and neutralized by the emergent system. Janelle's quiet observation exposes another truth. Detachment can be protective, but it also isolates. Analytical detachment shields from immediate emotional harm, yet it reduces access to genuine connection. The more one becomes a strategist within the system, the less one participates in authentic interaction. Emotional survival comes at a cost: distance. Christine's complete withdrawal offers a paradoxical power. By stepping entirely out of the system's influence, she controls the narrative of her own experience. The system cannot punish absence, but this power comes at a price too: disconnection. Influence is regained, but intimacy is sacrificed. The lesson here is brutal and elegant. In any hierarchy dependent on emotional attention, withdrawal is both the most damaging and most protective act. It destabilizes the system while preserving self-integrity. Participation reinforces control, absence preserves autonomy. And that brings us to the most unnerving insight. The family's apparent conflicts are just the surface. The real tension isn't about personalities. It's about emotional mechanics. Who is needed, who is wanted, who is optional. And the human psyche reacts predictably when these needs are unbalanced. Withdrawal, resentment, adaptation, survival. Nothing in this system is random. Every glance, gesture, and absence carries significance. Yet the casual viewer rarely notices. They see the drama, the shouting, the tearful confrontations, but they miss the invisible architecture of imbalance. And that is precisely why the tension is so magnetic. The spectacle hints at deeper truths that only careful analysis can reveal. In the end, this is not merely a story about favoritism or family tension. It's a case study in human behavior under asymmetrical emotional dependence. It's a demonstration of how invisible hierarchies shape perception, enforce compliance, and erode trust. And most importantly, it's a warning. Systems of dependence may appear stable until emotional calculus changes, and when it does, everything becomes irreversible. The tragedy is not the conflict itself, it's the inevitability. Every small gesture of attention or withdrawal matters, every pattern compounds, and once awareness dawns, the rules of engagement have already shifted. Survival and influence replace empathy and equality. Now let's focus on the most delicate and revealing layer, the unspoken rules of survival that govern the family's emotional ecosystem. This isn't about arguments, confrontations, or public scandals. It's about subtle, constant, invisible pressures that dictate behavior, choices, and relationships. Forces that the cameras can't fully capture, but that shape every interaction. At the core, there's a hierarchy of emotional capital. Cody is the central node, but he is not the only one exercising influence. Robin's position amplifies his authority because her alignment signals legitimacy. Attention is currency, and how it's distributed determines power. Those who master attention, not through force but through understanding its flow, gain stability. Those who fail to understand it experience anxiety, invisibility, and frustration. Mary's struggle illustrates this perfectly. Her emotional investment is high, but the returns are inconsistent. She oscillates between overcompensation, seeking visibility, asserting her place, and withdrawal, protecting herself from repeated neglect. Every swing in behavior reinforces the system's instability, even as she attempts to claim control. This cycle is psychologically exhausting. It creates the perfect storm of anticipation and disappointment that fuels conflict. Janelle's strategy, by contrast, is anticipatory. She reads the emotional currents rather than reacting to them. Detachment allows her to navigate the system without being destabilized, but it comes at a cost. Reduced intimacy and vulnerability. She maintains equilibrium, but in doing so, she subtly shifts from participant to observer. Her role is not passive, it's analytical survival. This is a nuanced power that the casual viewer rarely recognizes. Christine operates differently. Her withdrawal is strategic and absolute. By removing herself, she exposes the fragility of the system. Absence, paradoxically, becomes leverage. The family cannot enforce compliance on someone who opts out, but this power isolates her emotionally. Influence and intimacy are not freely compatible in this context. Christine gains clarity and agency at the cost of connection. Here's the unsettling truth. Emotional hierarchies like this are self-reinforcing. Patterns compound without conscious intention. The more Robin is central, the more the others adjust. The more the others adjust, the more Cody depends on Robin. Attempts to reset or disrupt these patterns often backfire because the system resists sudden change. The dynamics are subtle, almost invisible, but their consequences are profound. What's fascinating and tragic is how perception diverges from reality. Fans see drama, favoritism, or personal failings, but beneath the surface lies a web of adaptation, misinterpretation, and survival strategies. Cody misreads withdrawal as defiance, Mary overcompensates to gain recognition, Janelle detaches to protect herself, Christine disappears to reclaim agency. Each act is rational within the system, but appears chaotic to outsiders. Emotional imbalance drives every micro-decision. Even minor gestures, who sits next to whom, who gets noticed during family events, who receives verbal affirmation, carry weight. Over time, these small accumulations dictate relationships more than any argument or negotiation. The visible conflict is just the tip. The invisible structure determines outcomes. Consider the psychological cost. Constant assessment, calculation, and adaptation lead to chronic stress. Even those who appear calm, like Janelle, are engaged in ongoing monitoring. The effort to maintain equilibrium is exhausting but invisible, and the constant potential for misalignment, being overlooked, misinterpreted, or emotionally deprived, creates tension that never fully dissipates. This is why patterns repeat. Once a hierarchy of attention and dependence forms, it self-perpetuates. Efforts to disrupt it, through confrontation, withdrawal, or assertion, must contend with entrenched feedback loops. Attempting to reclaim attention often strengthens centrality rather than diminishes it, because the system responds predictably to novelty and threat. Now, the most critical insight: the stakes are irreversible. Small missteps, emotional miscalculations, or shifts in attention can permanently alter relationships. In systems like this, early patterns define long-term behavior. Once trust erodes or dependence shifts, recalibration is extremely difficult. Influence, attention, and emotional control are not just temporary, they are cumulative, and their effects persist even when behavior changes superficially. Even public perception plays a role in reinforcing these patterns. Media, social media, and fan narratives create feedback loops that validate the existing hierarchy. Attention from outside sources often mirrors internal patterns. Those who are already central receive more coverage and support, while those who withdraw or struggle for visibility remain marginal. External validation reinforces internal structure. Observe the psychological interplay of competition and alliance. The wives are not merely reacting to Cody, they are reacting to each other. Alliances form implicitly, often in response to perceived imbalance. Competition is rarely verbalized but omnipresent. A glance, a comment, or a gesture can signal alignment or dissent. The emotional micropolitics are constant, nuanced, and high stakes. The genius, or cruelty, of this system is its subtlety. There is no overt domination, yet power flows along predictable channels. Compliance and alignment are rewarded. Withdrawal and unpredictability carry consequences, yet sometimes also create leverage. Those who understand these rules gain resilience, influence, or control. Those who fail endure confusion, frustration, and marginalization. Here's the final unsettling point. The family's story is mesmerizing precisely because it mirrors fundamental human behavior under asymmetric emotional dependence. Hierarchies of attention exist everywhere, in workplaces, friendships, and families. What makes this case compelling is the visibility of patterns compounded by emotion, public scrutiny, and high stakes. It's an amplified laboratory of human psychology, exposing truths most people only intuitively sense. This is why the drama captivates. Viewers sense the stakes are real, the power dynamics are delicate, and any misstep could have lasting consequences. But they rarely see the architecture beneath the chaos. Emotional centrality, withdrawal, adaptation, and dependence drive the system more than personalities ever could. Once you recognize these dynamics, the arguments, conflicts, and tears take on a new weight. They are not just sensational TV, they are manifestations of an invisible, unrelenting psychological ecosystem. Attention, presence, and withdrawal are the true currencies, and their distribution dictates survival, influence, and connection. The conclusion is stark. In systems governed by asymmetrical emotional dependence, nothing is trivial. Every gesture counts. Every withdrawal matters. And once the hierarchy stabilizes, it is nearly impossible to undo. Attempts to disrupt it may be dramatic, but the underlying patterns remain entrenched, invisible, and powerful. If you thought you understood the family drama, you haven't scratched the surface. These invisible rules shape behavior in ways far more consequential than any confrontation, argument, or public declaration. And the most unsettling part? The system will continue to operate, largely unseen, long after the cameras are gone.